For hundreds of years, explorers and adventurers from across Europe braved the most perilous sea voyage imaginable in pursuit of a rumor, a mythological sea route, a shortcut that would take them from the Atlantic Ocean through to the Pacific on the other side. The rumored route was said to be located at the frigid northern edges of the Earth, along the coast of North America, through the Arctic Ocean. If real, the Northwest Passage would revolutionize sea trade, allowing European sailors to reach Asia in record time. Hundreds of sailors died in pursuit of the Northwest Passage. When one explorer and his crew finally made it through, no one could have predicted what they would find. This is the story of the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage is a 900-mile channel that passes through the Arctic Circle, weaving through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. For most of the year, the passage is frozen over and completely impassable, but during a small window, the summer months, the passage opens up. Even in the best conditions, however, the passage is riddled with icebergs, lined by the barren shores of Arctic islands, inhabited only by penguins and polar bears. And, for hundreds of years, no one was sure the passage even existed. The first expedition to attempt the passage turned back soon after leaving Baffin Island, their ship ill-equipped to handle Arctic temperatures. Subsequent expeditions perished attempting the passage, turned back, and sometimes disappeared. Most history books will tell you that the first successful passage didn't occur until 1906, when Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen arrived at Herschel Island. But Amundsen wasn't the first to make it through. The first successful passage occurred more than half a century earlier, but for reasons that will soon become clear, the successful passage was kept secret. For the last century and a half, students of history have been taught that the 1845 Franklin expedition simply disappeared while searching for the Northwest Passage. But, in fact, the Franklin expedition succeeded. Its success was one of the best-kept secrets in history. Until now. Sir John Franklin, the man who would one day make the first successful passage, came from humble origins. The ninth of 12 children, Franklin was raised in Spilsby, England, a landlocked market town far from a major city. As a young man, Franklin studied tax law with a focus on maritime taxation policies. After graduating with honors, he was hired as an in-house barrister on a trade ship sailing from London to Philadelphia. Little did he know his aptitude with maritime taxes would lead him on a grand adventure. Just 10 years later, Franklin was appointed captain of the HMS Erebus, the ship that would make the first successful journey through the Northwest Passage.
Franklin's appointment as captain of the HMS Terror was actually due to his skill as a maritime tax barrister. You see, Franklin was recommended for the job by civil servant Sir John Barrow, who happened to have a side business shipping tomatoes from South America to England. Franklin did a neat little legal magic trick to help Sir John avoid taxation on his tomatoes. Essentially, he convinced the judge that tomatoes should not be taxed under the British fruit tax, which was quite high, and should instead be taxed as a vegetable at a much lower rate. Franklin's argument hinged on the fact that while tomatoes are biologically a fruit, they are treated as a vegetable in cooking, since they are featured in salads as well as all manner of savory dishes. Thanks to Franklin, Sir John's tomatoes were taxed at a much lower rate, saving him hundreds of pounds. To thank Franklin, Sir John recommended him to the Admiralty for the Northwest Passage expedition.
2 ships departed England in 1845 to seek the Northwest Passage. Franklin was captain of the HMS Erebus with a younger officer, James Fitzjames, as his commander. The second ship, the HMS Terror, was commanded by Captain Francis Crozier. Altogether, the expedition had a crew of 24 officers and 110 men. The 2 ships featured the most state-of-the-art British technologies and could travel a breakneck speed of 4 knots an hour, or 4.5 miles per hour. The Terror and the Erebus reached Baffin Island, the final outpost before the passage, in July of 1845.
Things started going wrong as soon as the expedition left Baffin Bay. According to the captain's log, Franklin had equipped the HMS Erebus with a ship's library of over 1,000 books for the crew to enjoy. However, Franklin began charging such exorbitant fees for books returned late that members of the crew began to contemplate mutiny.
The library late fee fiasco created a ripple effect of low morale that led members of the crew to avoid essential job duties, endangering the entire operation. By the time the Erebus and Terror reached King William Island, the ships were in such poor condition, there were concerns they would soon begin taking on water and sink.
Franklin assigned a team of officers to disembark at King William Island to look for materials with which to repair the boats. Of course, the island was desolate, completely devoid of anything but rocks. The team did take the opportunity to leave a note in a cairn on the island, detailing their journey thus far. It was the last known written communication from the expedition, though of course, we now know the rest of the story.
Despite their badly damaged ships, the expedition soldiered on, hugging the shore of Victoria Island to avoid fields of icebergs. It was during a late-night storm that everything changed for the Franklin expedition.
The storm came unexpectedly and was so intense the crew was forced to shelter below deck. They were, quite frankly, completely unprepared. They could feel the ships being pushed along by swift currents, but they couldn't see a thing in the darkness of the storm.
When the storm broke, a deep fog lingered. Franklin, peering through his spyglass, could only make out vague shapes through the mist, and what little he could see seemed impossible. Out in the distance, an uncharted landmass of what appeared to be rolling green hills. Franklin, fearing he was finally losing his wits, kept his vision secret, shutting himself in his quarters with a pint of brandy. Late in the afternoon, hearing shouts above deck, Franklin drunkenly emerged from his cabin to find that his wild vision had been true. The ship was fast approaching a new continent of lush green hills, dotted with towering trees unlike any Franklin had ever seen. It was an unbelievable day aboard the HMS Erebus and Franklin. The crew, half crazy by this point, wondered little about the sudden appearance of an unknown landmass. They made for the continent just as quick as the boats would take them, setting anchor just as the sun was setting. The next days were a joyful blur for the Franklin expedition as the crew explored their new surroundings. Carrying packs filled with their dwindling supply of provisions, they began pushing inland. In the forest, they found plentiful food. They hunted venison and gathered strange mushrooms, which were more delicious than any they had tasted in England. As the crew recovered from their grueling voyage, they began to debate what to do next.
The crew was not particularly interested in exploring further. They were traumatized by the voyage, and the consensus was that they should stay put and try to repair the ships. But Franklin had quite an adventurous streak for a former tax barrister. He wanted to push on and explore the new continent. Ultimately, it was decided Franklin would explore further on his own, returning to the ships within a year's time to re-embark upon the voyage. Of course, this didn't happen. As we all know, the Erebus and Terror never completed their voyage, leading to the long-standing misconception that the Franklin expedition was a disastrous failure. But Franklin was another story.
What happened to the crew of the HMS Erebus and Terror is still unknown. It is possible they were unable to repair the ships. However, some historians believe they simply decided to stay in their new surroundings. Certainly, the prospect of resuming their journey would have been daunting. It is here the story of the Franklin expedition ends, and the story of the explorations of John Franklin begins.
Franklin diligently recorded and mapped his journey, so we have an excellent sense of what his newly discovered continent looked like.
Franklin named the new continent Middle Earth for the way it appeared so suddenly in the middle of nowhere. He began his journey in the shadow of the mountain range he called the Blue Mountains, following the Brandywine River deeper and deeper inland. Sometimes at night he thought he saw flickering lights and heard voices in the woods, and began to wonder if this new land was already inhabited. In his diaries, Franklin recounted one night in particular where he seemed to hear a great feast out in the woods. Merry laughter, voices raised in song, the sounds of cutlery clinking. He could even smell roasted meat and wine on the wind. He followed the sounds until he came to the edge of a small clearing. Through the trees, he could see twinkling lights and the shapes of strange-looking people moving about. But when he entered the clearing, all the lights immediately went out, and complete silence and darkness fell upon the clearing. Franklin found himself increasingly baffled by his new surroundings. Sometimes he wondered whether he was going mad. Other times he was convinced the inhabitants of this strange new land were playing tricks on him. Days turned into weeks as he followed the Brandywine River ever further, until one day, unexpectedly, he reached a road.
I mean, you can imagine how shocked he was. All this time journeying, and then suddenly something as mundane as a road.
Franklin began walking the road. It wasn't long before he had his first encounter with one of the inhabitants of Middle-earth. A wagon, not unlike the wagons Franklin was familiar with in England, appeared one day on the road and stopped in front of him. Its driver, an elderly man dressed all in gray robes with a sweeping silver beard down his chest, motioned for Franklin to join him. Though the two men did not share a language, they communicated easily, gesturing and repeating their words often. The bearded man introduced himself as Gandalf. Gandalf was short in stature, but his long white hair, his sweeping silver beard, and his broad shoulders made him look like some wise king out of ancient legend. In his aged face, under great snowy brows, his eyes were set like coals that could suddenly burst into fire. The Unpublished Diaries of Captain John Franklin. Gandalf brought Captain Franklin to the first true town he had seen in years. It was, Gandalf explained, called Hobbiton, and it was located in a place called the Shire. Franklin was as charmed by Hobbiton as he was shocked by its inhabitants. All the houses in the town were built directly into the hills, with perfectly round doors set into the hillside. Each house had a little garden in which grew all manner of herbs and vegetables, and the town's inhabitants seemed to spend most of their days leaning upon their garden fences or sitting on their porches, chatting cheerfully with neighbors. But though Franklin was charmed by the village, he was shocked by the strangeness of the villagers, who he learned from Gandalf were called hobbits. What is a hobbit? Hobbits have no beards. There is little or no magic about them except the ordinary, everyday sort which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly when large, stupid folk like you and me come blundering along, making a noise like an elephant which they can hear a mile off. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colors, chiefly green and yellow, wear no shoes because their feet grow natural leathery soles and thick, warm brown hair like the stuff on their heads, which is curly. They have long brown fingers, good-natured faces, and laugh deep, fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. The Unpublished Diaries of Captain John Franklin.
Apparently, Franklin adapted to his new surroundings quite well. Gandalf set him up in one of the guest rooms of a wealthy hobbit by the name of Bilbo, and the two developed a deep bond over their shared love of pipeweed and breakfast foods.
Franklin stayed in Middle-earth for many years, and if his diaries are to be believed, had many outrageous adventures. Some historians believe time may have moved more quickly in Middle-earth than it does in other parts of the world, while others think that Franklin must have invented some of his adventures. What is known, however, is that when Franklin left Middle-earth, only 5 years had passed in England.
How Franklin found his way out of Middle-earth and back to England largely remains a mystery. But find his way back he did. Unfortunately, few people believed his stories. In fact, it was largely agreed at the time that Franklin was not only a madman, but was not Sir John Franklin at all, though a passing resemblance was admitted.
Only Franklin's granddaughter believed his story. Young Camilla Franklin regularly visited the captain in the asylum to which he was committed. As Captain Franklin recounted his tales, young Camilla wrote them down, transcribing them in a journal she would then pass down to her own children. Eventually, one of Camilla's grandchildren would publish an edited version of Franklin's accounts, passing them off as fiction. The Lord of the Rings became one of the most popular novels of all time, though it was many years before Franklin's original diaries were discovered, and the truth of his adventures were acknowledged.